Okay, hi everyone. You should be able to hear audio now, but thank you for the questions to those who've asked questions in the chat. If at any point you are having difficulty with the audio or with seeing the slides or the slide progression, please let us know. My name is Jackie Grandy, and I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator here at the National Eating Disorder Information Center. And we are thrilled today to be welcoming Dori Zener as our webinar speaker today. So Dori's going to be presenting on women on the autism spectrum and eating disorders, discussing implications for treatment. And about Dori, Dori is an individual, couple, and family therapist at the Redpath Center and a social worker in the Child Development Program at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Dori's been working with families impacted by autism spectrum disorder, learning disabilities, and intellectual disabilities for over 10 years. At Holland Bloorview, she provides support to families after a new diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. She spearheaded the implementation of the Stepping Stones Triple P at Holland Bloorview, which is an evidence-based parenting program that increases parenting confidence and reduces challenging behavior in children with disabilities. Dori is actively involved with interprofessional education. She's collaborated with professionals across the GTA to develop Perspectives, which is an education program for interdisciplinary healthcare students to learn about providing collaborative care for people with autism spectrum disorders and developmental disabilities across the lifespan. Dori has been interviewed by national media regarding the impact of diagnosis and support options for families of children with autism spectrum disorder. And at the Redpath Center, Dori uses a strength-based, solutions-focused, and cognitive behavioral therapy approach to enhance the lives of those impacted by autism spectrum disorders and related mental health issues. So I'd like to welcome Dori today, and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie, for that great introduction. I just want to welcome everyone who's tuning into the webinar. It's so wonderful to see the interest across Canada in this topic. I'm here today as an individual, couple, and family therapist working with individuals on the autism spectrum. And this topic became aware to me that there's a real overlap in the features of women with autism spectrum disorders and women with anorexia in particular. So that's what this talk is going to be about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the two conditions, the overlap between the two, and what it means for treatment. And this is a really exciting area with a lot of opportunities to explore further research. Thought I'd start out with a blog entry. When people are looking for information these days, they go to the internet, and this is a really great quote which encapsulates a lot of the issues and overlaps between autism spectrum disorders and eating disorders. I developed an eating disorder when I was just turning 18. A lot of things in my life were outside of my control, and it was horrifying. I think it started off as control. I wanted to control something in my life. I couldn't work, so I couldn't help with our finances. I couldn't go out because I was scared to explore the city. I've always been picky about food. The hypersensitivity makes me gag and feel physically sick if I put anything in my mouth. A, I don't like the taste of. B, that has a texture I don't like. Anything with pulp or bits in it, for example, freaks me out. Or C, that consists of too many different textures and tastes. A burger with all the fixins, a sandwich, curry, most pizzas, salads. Putting new foods in my mouth has always been a touchy subject for me. I'm guessing that if there's a link between AS, which means Asperger's syndrome, and anorexia, it most likely either stems from the hypersensitivity to food, some form of self-harm from self-blame and guilt. It's hard to know why you have no empathy or why you can't make friends or to deal with bullying, or because of needing to control something, anything in your life. That's from my experience anyway. So again, this is a blog. This is from Psych Forum. And it was a blog talking about personal experiences of having Asperger's and anorexia. And I think what you see throughout the presentation are some themes that this woman brought up that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start out by defining autism spectrum disorder. I understand that we have two groups, well, a few groups of people today watching. Some people are already very familiar with autism spectrum disorder, so what I'm talking about might be a bit of review. Other people come from the world of eating disorders, are very familiar with anorexia nervosa. And then there's some people who've been personally connected by possibly one or both conditions. So I look forward to hearing any questions or comments at the end of this presentation. There's a chat feature that you can type in your questions, and I will be addressing them at the end, so feel free to write them down and we'll get to them. What is autism spectrum disorder? Autism spectrum disorder is a neurological, pervasive developmental disorder with deficits in 3 core areas. The prevalence of ASD is 1 in 88, and that was from 2012 Center for Disease and Control. They're doing even more studies now. It looks like the rates might even be going up into 1 in 50. So we're looking at 1 to 2% of the population being affected by this neurological disorder. Boys are nearly 5 times more likely than girls to receive a diagnosis. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about what the disorder looks like. As I mentioned, there's 3 core areas of deficit. There's social skills. So social skill challenges can range from a complete lack of interest to friends to a desire for friendships, but difficulty maintaining developmentally appropriate relationships. Communication difficulties might be as severe as actually being nonverbal and not being able to communicate your needs through words, or being very articulate and very engaging, but have difficulty reading and understanding and also using gestures for nonverbal behavior. Behavior deficits look at rigid and repetitive behaviors. Some people with autism spectrum disorder really like routine. They have difficulty with change and struggle with transitions. You may see some very focused interests or areas where they really like one particular topic and then get to know it very, very well. There's some associated challenges with ASD that many people experience. One is called a theory of mind deficit, and this is a challenge where people, you may hear difficulties with empathy, so difficulties understanding the perspective of others and being able to integrate those perspectives into their own behavior and actions. There's also challenges with executive functioning difficulties. Executive functioning difficulties is basically the conductor of our brain, so the ability to shift, to inhibit our behavior, to control our emotions, difficulties with memory, difficulties with planning and organization, and sometimes difficulties with materials. You may see someone on the spectrum extremely bright, and their room looks like a complete disaster. They just have difficulty organizing their space and their time. People on the spectrum often experience sensory processing issues, and I want to point out that this is an area that is gaining more and more awareness, and in fact, the DSM-5 that's coming out this year with the new definition of autism spectrum disorders includes this topic of sensory processing issues. This is where someone has difficulty processing their environment, whether they're hypersensitive to stimulation or hyposensitive. And this definitely will play a role in some of the eating issues that will be discussed today. There's also high incidence of depression, anxiety, OCD, and learning difficulties for individuals on the spectrum. When most people think of autism spectrum disorders, or I'm going to just start saying autism or the spectrum for short, they probably picture a man, possibly Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, or maybe a young boy, nonverbal, having difficulty communicating their needs. Women on the spectrum are a whole other group of people with wonderful strengths. And in the last number of years, a few brave women have actually come out and shared their stories with us. And the reason why I have the picture of these women up today is because each one of them came to their diagnosis in a different way and wrote to tell us about their experiences. And in my own clinical practice, what I see is this combination of presentation of how women come to develop their diagnosis. The first woman you'll see there on, I guess, your left is Rudy Simone. Rudy wrote the book Asper Girls. She's also written 3 other books. She was diagnosed in her 40s, just a few years ago, and this was a self-diagnosis. She was going out with a guy at the time who a lot of people were saying, I think this guy may be on the spectrum, he seems a little bit different. And she started doing some reading, and realized, hey, I think I'm on the spectrum too. Since then, she's become an incredible advocate for women and girls on the spectrum, and her book is a great way to understand different perspectives of women who have been diagnosed with ASD. A lot of you probably recognize the woman in the middle, Temple Grandin. Some of you may have seen the movie that Claire Danes portrayed her. Temple Grandin is more of a classic ASD situation. She was nonverbal up until the age of 4, had a lot of repetitive behaviors, used the deep pressure machine to really help calm her body down. She's gone on to be an articulate, wonderful advocate, and also a PhD level individual who's an expert in her field. Leanne Holiday Willie is a mother, and when her 15-year-old daughter got diagnosed with Asperger's, she said, hey, wait a minute, this looks a lot like me, and realized that a lot of the challenges that she's been having throughout her lifetime could be explained by the diagnosis of Asperger's. I just want to point out here that I'm using the term Asperger's and autism sort of interchangeably. Asperger's is what some might think of as the highest functioning form of autism spectrum disorder, and in the new DSM, it's going to be all rolled in together under one diagnosis, which is why I'm speaking about it that way. Just to go back for a second, Leanne's book is called Pretending to be Normal, and you hear that phrase a lot in the women I work with. They work very hard to try to fit in and to feel normal. Excuse me. What we have here, for those of you who are able to see, is a study that was done within the office that I work in at the Redpath Center by Dr. Lillian Burke and Dr. Kevin Stoddard, as well as their student. And they took a profile of 60 women that they had diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders over the years, and took a look at some of the other issues that they were experiencing. So one thing that really comes up that's a theme when talking about females on the spectrum is they're very much underdiagnosed. A lot of women will come in with other mental health issues. They may have been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, OCD, borderline personality disorder, a lot of labels before they get to this maybe more accurate or in addition to a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders. What else is different with women on the spectrum than men? Women tend to be much more social. They're really good at faking it, some of them. They spend a lot of time observing the other women around them, trying to understand the nonverbal body language, trying to understand how to hold their bodies, what to say, and when to say it. The thing is, it doesn't come natural, and it's extremely exhausting. So a lot of the women I speak to talk about holding it together during the day, being able to carry on conversations with difficulty, and then coming home and just falling apart. So what that might look like is an emotional meltdown where you may see someone's sort of true autistic behaviors coming out with jumping and screaming and flapping, or maybe in more subtle ways where someone else in the family gets sort of a huge outburst and that person is just not able to control their emotions, or others may withdraw and need some quiet time and really need to balance out the amount of energy that they spend being social with some quiet sort of me time. Another difference for women on the spectrum is a lot of them tend to have actually excellent theory of mind and empathy skills. And again, I'm talking about women who are sort of in the higher functioning range of autism, thinking about higher functioning autism and Asperger's. It's just that these skills fall apart when they are under stress. So when they are involved in social situations that they're not comfortable in, or when they are processing a lot of sensory information, or when they're processing a lot of information, verbal information that's challenging for them, that's when we see the empathy and the theory of mind becoming affected. In the study of 60 women that my colleagues did, some of the additional diagnoses that they found, those women were experiencing high rates of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, high rates of OCD, sleep disorders, panic disorders, and as we talked about as well, learning difficulties and learning disorders, anxiety and depression, and 21.7% of those women also had an eating disorder at some point in their life. And there's another great book by Shannon Nichols talking about women and girls on the spectrum, and looking at that, she talks about how anorexia is the most common eating disorder that women on the spectrum tend to experience. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, is the link between anorexia and Autism Spectrum Disorder. So I'm going to do my best to define anorexia nervosa. I am by no means an expert in this area, but this is the DSM criteria. So there are 4 aspects of the criteria: refusal to maintain your body weight at or above a minimally normal weight for age and height, weight loss leading to the maintenance of body weight to less than 85% of that expected, or failure to make expected weight gain during a period of growth leading to body weight less than 85% of that expected. Intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, even though underweight. A disturbance in the way one's body weight or shape are experienced. Undue influence of body weight or shape on self-evaluation, or denial of the seriousness of the current low body weight. And then there's the physical symptom, which relates to the woman's periods. Some associated challenges are mood disorders, anxiety, and OCD. So already we're starting to see an overlap between the women on the spectrum that we discussed, as well as substance abuse. And the cause for anorexia nervosa looks like it's 4-fold. There's biological, social, psychological, and intrapersonal reasons why women develop this eating disorder. And it looks like the lifetime prevalence of eating disorder, of anorexia in women is about 1% and 0.3% in men. So this is a disorder that affects more women than men, versus autism spectrum disorder we've looked at as much higher rates in men. Just going to pause for a minute. So this is really the reason why we're here today, is this overlap. If you look at the research, some people have suggested there's possibly a genetic link between autism spectrum disorders and anorexia. If we look at the rates, ASD is very highly overrepresented in the population of women with anorexia. Aldershaw did a study looking at the cognitive profile of both groups, and there was a lot of similarities. So both individuals experience rigidity in their behavior and their thinking. There's a high tendency for perfectionism. Women with anorexia are also demonstrating the theory of mind deficits, the same deficits that individuals on the spectrum are experiencing. Both are having executive functioning challenges and experiencing high rates of mood and anxiety disorders. There are some things about individuals on the spectrum, though, that put them at higher risk for developing eating disorders, and those are the ASD-specific characteristics. I talked a little bit about sensory processing before. So sensory processing is a huge issue among individuals on the spectrum. This could really affect their feeding. So for some people, texture is a big deal when it comes to eating. There can be a gag reflex. I don't know if any of you experience this, but for some individuals eating some foods, they can't eat creamy foods, or they want to eat only crunchy foods. So a lot of rigidity around that processing, and it actually makes them feel sick when they're eating certain foods. Sound can come into play as well. People on the spectrum might be sensitive to sound, which could limit where they actually enjoy their eating, which could, again, limit their eating opportunities. So eating in a cafeteria for children, very, very challenging because it's loud. It's also very, very smelly. Eating in restaurants, eating in food courts, this is really reducing the opportunities for where individuals can eat. There's also issues around coordination and body awareness. A lot of individuals on the spectrum are kind of clumsy. They don't actually know necessarily where their body is in space. And this can lead to a bit of a conflict between themselves and their bodies for a number of reasons. For one reason, they feel like they can't trust their body. They're trying to move their body in a certain way, and it's just not listening to them. They also have body awareness issues because their image of themselves may actually be distorted because they have difficulty understanding their body in space. Their limited social insight also plays a role here because with the theory of mind difficulties, they have difficulty perceiving how others may view their body. Gastrointestinal issues are huge for people on the spectrum. They're doing a lot of studies right now to really understand the bodies of individuals on the spectrum to see are there different ways in which they process foods. But it looks like in Rudy Simone's book, Asperger's, Almost every woman that she interviewed had some kind of GI issue, whether it was chronic nausea, food allergies, feeling foggy from eating processed food, irritable bowel syndrome. One woman talked about food actually feeling like glass when it hit her stomach. And some people on the spectrum also discussed just having a feeling of no appetite as well. I can really relate this to some of the clients I work with. Some of them are very cerebral in that they're really not in touch with their bodies. They can actually go a whole day without eating, and it's just because they haven't been tuning into their body's signals. So they haven't been listening to the fact that, oh, I'm thirsty, or oh, I'm hungry. It's only once they are completely depleted that they realize, oh, I think I need to eat something or drink something. I'm just looking here at the comments, just a minute. Someone's saying they're having difficulty with the video and the sound, so we just want to see if this is for other people as well. Okay. Thank you, Megan Kay, for your comment. Thank you, everybody. That's reassuring. Another issue that comes up a lot is medication side effects. Some of the people that I see, they're on a cocktail of medications, whether it's SSRIs or antipsychotics, to help them with their mood. And unfortunately, this has the side effect of gaining weight. So these women who are already feeling, whether it's self-conscious, they may have low self-esteem from a history of bullying or exclusion, now also are having a body weight size that they're not comfortable with and they don't know how to control.
Yeah, so some people may have connection issues, and what it's looking like is that those are probably connectivity issues that may be coming up on individual computers. If anyone is having an issue, let us know, and we will certainly get a recorded copy of the webinar out to you, and that recorded copy won't have any issues. So we're going to keep going here, and thank you for those of us who are, those of you who are letting us know how it's going on your end.
Okay. I hope everyone's taking some time to write some questions. It's kind of awkward doing this one-sided presentation. I'd love to say, is this resonating with you? Do you find this in your work? Have you felt this for yourself? What are you thinking? So please think about these things and keep your comments at the end, and I'm very happy to have a rich discussion at the end. Just forward the seats as they lost them. Okay. Some people have said, well, where did this percentage of almost 1/3 of the population with anorexia having ASD? So this came from a longitudinal study from Ankar Sater et al. In 2012. And this is an 18-year post-treatment study. They looked at 51 women with anorexia over an 18-year period. They evaluated at 4 points during those 18 years. And one of the areas that they looked at was ASD. They did a number of interviews, formal interviews for diagnosis, as well as getting developmental history on the individuals. And at some point in time, during those 18 years, 32% of that population met criteria for ASD. I want to say it's different than having ASD. They presented as if they had autism spectrum disorder, but what we don't know is, were they born this way? Was this part of their pervasive developmental issue, or is it something that arose as a result of the experience of having an eating disorder, or is it a combination of the two? And that's really something that needs to be fully examined further. Something else that's interesting about that group, so 32% of those women met criteria for ASD, but only 11% actually had a formal diagnosis. So only 11% of those people knew that they had ASD, which meant that their treatment teams didn't know that they had ASD, their families didn't know that they had symptoms of ASD, and they didn't know that they have symptoms of ASD. And for those of you who either are on the spectrum or know people on the spectrum, you know that it's very helpful to be aware of these specific challenges so that you can cater treatment and interact with them in a way that is very helpful for the population. A couple other things I want to point out is there's actually a lot of similarities to the women who had ASD in the study and those who did not. So there was no difference at all at the age of onset, that they all developed their eating disorders around the same time. Similar BMI index, and both of them had coexisting mental disorders. The only difference they saw is that 18 years post-treatment, so even almost 20 years after they received their eating disorder treatment, the anorexia and ASD group had the highest prevalence of personality disorders, and here they're referring to OCD specifically, and the lowest Morgan-Russell score, so their weight was lowest. So why is that? Is it because these women are in semi-starvation states or in starvation states and it's causing this presentation of ASD? Or do these women already have a pre-existing condition of ASD that is becoming much more, becoming to the surface now that they're also affected by their eating disorder? I mentioned that of that large group of women who met criteria for ASD, only 11% were aware that they had this diagnosis. And I think it'll be really helpful for practitioners who are working with individuals with anorexia nervosa, as well as individuals with ASD, if they were aware that some of the people in the room, in fact, almost 1/3 of the people in the room, may be thinking like a person with ASD, maybe interacting with the world the same as someone with ASD, and may really benefit from strategies that helps people with ASD. So what I did to gather information, I spoke to some of my female clients. I also spoke to our Redpath Asperger's Women's Group, which is a group of women between the ages of 30 and 60 with a new diagnosis of ASD. And I solicited their feedback. I said, what would you need in order to participate effectively in group treatment? And the reason why I'm focusing on groups is because, in fact, a lot of the eating disorder treatment is delivered in a group format, but this could also be applied to individual work as well. So the quotes that you see are from the women that I solicited information from. So the first thing that people said when working in groups is they really need clearly defined group norms. One woman said, I prefer parameters to be well-defined and well understood amongst the group. Examples, segment time limits, what is and isn't appropriate to talk about, what would be a tangent that would be best handled in a different time or place. Another woman said, I realize extroverts or other personalities do well with free and full expression in more free and flowing spontaneous ways. To me, this feels like the extroverts are hijacking our meeting time. So you can really see there's a different type of group experience that these women are looking for. They're not looking for open free flow. In fact, they're really looking for a lot of structure, a lot of predictability, and a lot of clarity about what's appropriate in a group setting and what's not. So what are some strategies to employ? Make sure that there are clearly defined norms, that they're actually recorded and posted on the wall and enforced. Parameters around who can speak and for how long. Sometimes people on the spectrum really miss picking up on those cues of, okay, your turn's over. So really being very explicit with thank you for sharing. Let's hear from someone else now. Making sure it's clear how long the individuals have to speak and who should speak next. It's also important to talk about topics. A lot of women struggle to figure out, what can I talk about? Is it appropriate for me to talk about my dog here? Or how much detail should I be giving about my personal life? So please, again, be very explicit about what is and isn't appropriate in a group context. I put this next slide in here because I really want to stress that women on the spectrum are fabulous. They're wonderful. I enjoy working with them, and I think you would really enjoy working with them too if you're able to tap into their knowledge. So some of the things they talk about, how can they be the most active participants in group? One woman says, I think I have a lot to contribute, but I have a hard time organizing, articulating, and presenting my thoughts. I function far better if I can prepare ahead of time any of my contribution. Thus, needing to know ahead of time where we're going next, etc. is helpful. Another woman said, all talking might be overwhelming to process and remember. Allow and encourage members to write down and take notes and ask for repetition and clarification. So how can we get these women who have a lot to offer to share their experiences with the group. And one thing that would really help is to send out an agenda prior to the group to help them formulate ideas. I find the women that I've worked with really are very thoughtful. They sit down and they take a lot of time to jot down their notes, and they feel much more confident and prepared if they have that coming into the group. Always provide additional processing time. Some people on the spectrum, we talked about learning difficulties. Some people have processing difficulties. So try to be specific, use concise language, and then pause to give time for people to absorb the information. You can encourage participants to write down their ideas during treatment so they don't feel like they're going to lose their ideas and their thoughts. And I strongly recommend using multiple teaching techniques. If someone on the spectrum is just watching this right now with me just talking at them, they might get pretty bored. So make sure you have readings, you have presentations, visuals, opportunities for video, using role plays, they can really practice techniques, and getting people into smaller groups. So if you're doing a larger group treatment session, break them down into pairs, partners, or groups of 3, because they may feel more comfortable sharing information in smaller groups where they don't have to try to read the body language and the intention of all the group members who are contributing. I just want to point out as well, I mentioned that socializing is very draining for people on the spectrum, so understand that they're putting in a lot of effort to be present, more effort than say you and I, unless you're on the spectrum, but being able to contribute to the group. So it'll probably be very exhausting for them to participate, and you really want to reinforce and praise the people for putting in all the effort they have. Keep in mind as well that a lot of these women have had a history of invalidating social experiences. Some of them have always thought they were odd or strange, or they were told that they're not good enough or they don't fit in. So make sure that you're really trying to create a very safe space for sharing, where bullying and exclusion is not replicated, because it is true that some of these women, some of their behaviors are different, and some of the way they view the world is different, but it doesn't make it less. It's actually more, and we can really learn a lot from those participants. This next slide talks about strategies to learn new skills. One of the women was saying that she would do much better if she had to learn something like eating a new food if she could practice the eating session or watch a video like a social story. And she said that if she can see practical applications of something and then actually engage in that herself, then she can have the buy-in. Another woman talked about some of the struggles that she has with multitasking. She said, I can't listen, write, socialize, and do a new task all at the same time. New tasks will be more overwhelming and harder to do when doing other things, even talking at the same time. So always keep in mind that some of the participation in the group, or some of the listening and processing, can be very taxing and draining. What are some strategies you can do? A common strategy for teaching in the ASD world is first then. So first we do this, then we do that. We want to provide visuals, a video, or a sequence of steps. Make sure that they have ample opportunities to practice new skills in a supported environment. And what's great is if now with technology you can grab a phone and actually video someone participating in doing a new skill so they can watch it back, so they can grow their own self-awareness and what they look like in participating in this, this new skill. And always, as I mentioned, provide lots of positive reinforcement. Being social is stressful. Having to talk, having to interpret the signals around you is stressful. And women and individuals on the spectrum, we know, can sometimes struggle with stress management and emotional regulation. So let's say if you're a group facilitator, or you're working with individuals on the spectrum, or women with anorexia who have ASD symptoms, provide warnings for transitions and changes to routine. This really helps an individual if they know what's coming up. It really reduces anxiety and stress. Some women said that they prefer having some kind of background music, soft classical music, or nature sounds to help filter the noise. Other women talked about movement breaks being very effective. So in the middle, getting up, doing your stretches, doing your yoga, doing your walking, get your body moving to get your brain moving. And I've pictured here a few fidget toys For those occupational therapists who are watching, I'm sure you recognize some of these. For people with young children, you might recognize some of these as well. Fidget toys are a great way to keep your hands occupied to calm your body down. And I'd highly recommend having fidget toys available in the group, in the room for people to play with. And again, to destigmatize that it's normal. We all fidget with our coins in our pockets or with our fingers. So having overt toys like that is showing that this is a positive way to regulate stress. We talked a little bit about group process and what would be helpful within a group. There's also strategies that can help outside of a group. Women would really benefit from clear expectations of what they should and shouldn't be talking about outside the group. Should I be talking about to the other participants? How much should I be talking to the other participants? What should we be talking about? What shouldn't we be talking about? Other women said they'd really benefit from having either an email group or an online forum where they can share ideas. This way, they can be in the comfort of their own home. They can have the opportunity to process the material at their own pace, and they can write their ideas out, which sometimes come out in a much clearer way than their verbal ideas. Other women talked about having certain resources on hand, like a lending library with journals, again, so they can go absorb the information in their own time. And the idea of a quiet room or a snooze-on room, if while participating in treatment for, let's say, eating disorder treatment, and you're going from group to group, it's important to have some downtime, and that this is sanctioned by the facility. There's some kind of quiet room or even snooze-alone room, which is a sensory stimulating calming room for people to calm down. There's also a possibility of perhaps there needs to be a modified treatment schedule. This is really common now in universities where students are coming in with learning disabilities or learning differences or mental health issues, including autism spectrum disorder, and they will provide a balanced course load or a different course load. And I think that should be considered as well in eating disorder programs, that we cannot expect these women to participate in 3-4 groups a day. It's just too much for them to be able to participate successfully. And is there an opportunity to combine both individual and group treatment so they can have some one-on-one time? I was thinking too, it would be so nice if there was like a social coach. So again, clearly saying, yes, social challenges may come up, and here's someone you can talk to. If you have any questions about social situations, they can give you a little bit of coaching. So where do we go from here? Here's a question, and this is really posed to individuals in the eating disorder world. Is there a place for a routine autism spectrum disorder screening when treating for eating disorders? Is it important to know that the individuals you're working with may also have an autism spectrum disorder or have symptoms of an autism spectrum disorder? It's important because these symptoms don't necessarily go away post-treatment, and that's what's been found in the studies. So even perhaps if the eating disorder is gone, the ASD symptoms still remain. So I would argue that there is benefit to doing the ASD screening to inform the individual that, yes, this is a cluster of challenges that you're experiencing. There are a group of people that have these similar challenges, and these are some of the things that can really help you. And I think this would also help families of individuals with the eating disorder and these symptoms, as well as the treatment groups. So if ASD is the reason why someone's developing an eating disorder, perhaps we need to go about a different way of treating the anorexia, such as targeting the rigid repetitive behavior and trying to replace those repetitive behaviors with more functional behaviors, and trying to decrease anxiety and looking at issues around preference for sameness and routine, and help with a lot of the sensory processing issues. Sensory processing plays a huge role, as I said before, in eating, and there are ways that people can be coached and reintroduced to foods that were once quite aversive, and people can become comfortable with eating them. So I think it's important to understand the underlying cause of the eating disorder to see if ASD is playing a role, and then target treatment that way. That is my presentation for today. I'm opening it up to discussion, and I want to point out at the end as well, there is the references list for today's presentation, so where I got my citations from, and also the new DSM-5 diagnosis of ASD that's coming up. I know I talked about it a lot today, so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and ideas that you might have.
I also want to thank everyone on behalf of the National Eating Disorder Information Center for joining us today. We've gotten some really interesting comments that have come up in the chat. Folks are saying that this, from what we're hearing, that this is in some cases a very accurate description of clients that are living with anorexia and are on the spectrum. One commentator is saying that anorexia is notoriously underdiagnosed in males. Absolutely true, and certainly an interesting consideration when we're thinking about the spectrum as well. Now, one question that did come up during the chat was whether introverts and extroverts would benefit equally from some of the group techniques that Dori was mentioning. I wonder, Dori, if you have any thoughts on introversion versus extroversion in terms of benefiting from these techniques.
That's an interesting question. I think when you think about a group experience, there's many aspects to it, but one of it is sharing your own experience, and the other half is learning from others. So I think anyone, regardless of whether or not they're introverted or extroverted, would be able to benefit from hearing about the personal perspectives of others, what's helped them get through difficult times, and some of the challenges they're having, so they don't feel alone. So in that case, I don't think there's a difference. And, you know, is there a place to, should introverts be forced to participate in group treatment? I know that's not the question, but I guess it's really up to the individual. If this is a skill in an area that they want to improve upon and they want to feel more confident in, then this is a great way to practice talking to others in a safe setting, and it could be definitely therapeutic for them in terms of their treatment. And I think extroverts are great in group too, but sometimes the extroverts need to also be structured and limited in their contributions, because extroverts, as one of the women said and who I interviewed, have a tendency to hijack the group and take over the presentation. So I think it's a wonderful balance to have both learning styles and both personality styles in the group so they can learn from each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the other comments that we're hearing here is that kind of structure that you mentioned in group settings could be very beneficial for clients who are not necessarily on the spectrum but do have anorexia. Some very positive feedback here and a few more questions. One other question that's come up is there any sort of preference that you'd recommend in terms of what to treat first? Are you looking at problematic characteristics associated with the spectrum first, or are you looking at treating the eating disorder first, or do you treat both simultaneously?
Interesting question. I would say that safety comes first, and that's paramount. So if someone's eating difficulties or at a place where their physical safety is at risk or their mental health safety is at risk, then you definitely need to focus on trying to increase their healthy eating and gaining weight. But you may need to use some of those ASD strategies that I've talked about in order to get there. And I want to mention that in terms of therapeutic strategies for individuals on the spectrum, the evidence-based cognitive-behavioural therapy is used for individuals with ASD. It's also used for people with eating disorders. So some of the therapeutic techniques are very much, could be used simultaneously to help both.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Erin is asking, do you think that there's any danger in normalizing fidgeting and activity as a way of coping with anxiety if eating disorders are also a diagnosis? So in eating disorder treatment, those behaviors could be seen as trying to burn calories, which as a practitioner is something that you'd be vigilant and looking for. Any danger in normalizing fidgeting, do you think, with bearing this in mind?
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective because I'm not coming from the eating disorder world that way, but I would say if it's strictly in terms of moving their hands and being able to touch something, that I wouldn't see that as being an issue. If we're talking about fidgeting as jumping up and down or doing jumping jacks 100 times in the middle of a group session, obviously I think that would be inappropriate, but
it sounds like context would definitely play a part there as well. It's a great question. Thank you, Erin. Barbara is saying, having worked as a school psychologist in the past, she's somewhat aware of social stories Can you expand on or talk about sort of examples of application of this sort of social storying or modeling that you mentioned before?
Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with social stories is a technique from Carol Gray. Carol Gray came up with this as a way of trying to put situations, as Jackie used the word, in context. So it would be a story, and this is often used for children on the spectrum, but could be used in a more sophisticated way with adults. So for children, let's say they're having something that could be particularly anxiety-provoking the next day, you would maybe a week in advance or a few days in advance talk about a story and put the person within the story. So let's say it's Dori. Tomorrow, Dori will be going to school. It's Dori's first day of school, so it's normal for Dori to feel nervous. Dori might feel anxious in her tummy and might not want to say goodbye to mommy and daddy, but Dori will feel better when Dori goes to school. So social stories is a way of creating a narrative around a difficult topic to help the individual resolve and understand their feelings about it. So in terms of eating disorders, one way of using a social story perhaps might be to talk about how the individual perceives their body versus how other perceives their body and put that in a social story, or introducing new foods or introducing new activities into an individual's day through a social story as a technique.
Great. We have a very specific question here from, it looks like Anitsu, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asking if you know of any specific statistics around percentages of symptoms, of ASD symptoms which remain after recovery from anorexia. That's quite a specific statistic.
Yes.
I wonder if you have any thoughts there. Or
I do have some references that I have included there, which did talk about that. I know in that one study, we can't generalize from 51 individuals, although it was over an 18-year period. They did talk about that 27% of women met criteria for ASD, and at 18 years, 32% did, so 5% sort of lost that ASD category post-treatment. But overall, I'm not sure. Let me just see here. Take a look at your references list at the end and see if you can find something there as well. If not, we can always send you something. I see a question here from Candy M that I just want to address, because I forgot to mention. They said, if we're going to screen for ASD routinely, how do we do that? Is there a tool? So there is a tool that was used in the longitudinal study that I spoke of. And one is, actually, if you can go back, Jackie. There's two tools that I've listed here. One is the Autism Spectrum Quotient, or the AQ, via Simon Baron Cohen. And the other one is the Asperger's Syndrome Diagnostic Interview, the ASDI. If you wanted to do a more detailed diagnosis, there's the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, as well as the developmental history. And this would need to be done by a trained psychologist or physician.
Okay, thanks, Dori. And thank you as well to the ACT information officers for sharing Cheryl Gray's website. It's very helpful. We do have about 10 minutes left of time. If there are questions that are coming up for folks, please type them into the chat box there and we'll address them. And I think that it's certainly a really underserved area that you're touching on, Dori, in terms of new research that's emerging, in terms of shedding a light on some of the, the dovetailing that's happening between anorexia and between folks on the spectrum and their symptoms. It's certainly a really interesting topic. It seems like we've been getting some positive feedback. And I know that a few people did have connection issues. Apologies for that on behalf of the technology. Again, we'll give it another moment or two to see if there's other questions that are coming up. And yes, Dori has given us permission to share a protected copy of her presentation. So we will be getting that out to everyone who registered in the webinar. We also had quite a few people that couldn't join us today, but we'll be sharing this with them as well. And we've also been recording this webinar, so we can provide a copy of the recording as well.
I just want to mention something too. For the April bulletin, for the NEDIC bulletins, the April edition, I did write an article about this topic as well, so you'll have a chance to read some of it in a little more detail. And I'm really interested in continuing a conversation with people who work in the field, because I think I can learn a lot from individuals who work in the eating disorder field that I'm not aware of. I'm working with my clients in private practice, as well as with the families of young children that I work with at Hull and Bloorview. And I think you could probably learn a lot too from some of the strategies that I've learned from my clients and some of the things that we could bring to the table too. So I'd love to look at any kind of future collaboration. I'm just going to go to the slide here with my my email addresses there as well.
And there's a question here from Barbara. Barbara's just basically saying that she's curious about, I guess, how practitioners that are working with ASD and practitioners specializing in eating disorders, are they sort of aware of this overlap? In terms of what you've seen, Dori, maybe in terms of colleagues, people that are working in your field, are you seeing that people are aware of the overlap, of its implications? Is this very much a new area that folks are still learning about?
One area that's been well known for a long time is that they see children on the spectrum are picky eaters, and they really focus a lot on this picky eater. And I just wanted to think about what that picky eater grows up to become, I guess, in a way, and how to work on that. So certainly there's an awareness that there are GI issues in individuals on the spectrum. There are sensory sensitivities. There's rigidity around choosing foods. Now we're hoping that there'll be more awareness about this topic, because a lot of people from the ASD world have seen this today. So thank you for watching. Also, I did the presentation, a similar presentation to the eating disorder team here at Toronto General Hospital. So they are now more aware of this overlap too. And I think there's going to be continued and ongoing growing awareness of it.
Mm-hmm. I certainly hope so. Well, Dori, I want to thank you again for coming in today. We do have another question here, again from Candy. So Candy's asking, do you know of any doctors who specialize in this? Many immediately dismiss eating problems as eating disorders and minimize the possibility that it is related to the spectrum. So do you know if this is an area of specialty practice for any doctors that you've come across?
I'm not sure if one individual is practicing in this area, but I see more as a future of collaboration across disciplines. Where I work at the Red Path Center, where I have my private practice, the director, Kevin Stoddard, recently wrote a book about adults on the spectrum and talked about a woman that they treated who was on a G-tube feed for more than 10 years and then received a diagnosis of ASD and received help regarding her ASD and is actually living a healthy life. And I'm sure there's a lot more going on there. But what I'm trying to get at is if any people that you may suspect may be struggling in some of these areas, it is hard for an adult to receive a diagnosis of ASD. Unfortunately, right now in Ontario, the Red Path Center does offer a private assessment for individuals where they would do psychological assessment and ASD screening, but I'm not aware currently of any two groups working together to address this issue, especially in adults.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, Dori. Well, I think we are going to close the webinar at this point in time. Dori has been kind enough to share her email address with us all. So I know that I'll remain in touch with her, and I hope that all of you will also remain in touch with us at the National Eating Disorder Information Centre. You can reach us by email at nedic@uhn.ca. It's NEDIC@uhn.ca. I will be getting a copy of the presentation and a recording out to everyone. I want to thank Dori again for coming in and joining us today. I want to thank you all for joining us as well and for your questions and very insightful comments. It's been a pleasure having you, and we are looking forward to hosting more regular webinars in the future here at NEDIC. So we'll hope that you'll join us for some of those as well.
I just want to say I'm seeing some people in the chat are writing thank you, and this is going to really inform their practice. And thank you so much for that feedback. It means a lot to me. So thanks, and glad you found it helpful.
All right. Thanks, everybody.